Hey guys, Goon here. In this video I'm going to go a little more in depth with my active skill games and support games which I'm using for my Cold Witch. And I'm going to start off with the auras. I'm using 3 auras. I'm using the Discipline aura because it increases my energy shield by quite a large margin, since the energy value that is stated on the aura is actually increased by the energy shield modifiers that you have for your character, which includes energy shield increase by intelligence and energy shield increase by energy shield nodes. And because of that, instead of 359, my energy shield is increased by about 1200. And since the aura doesn't really reserve that much mana, this is the aura that you want to use for energy shield based characters. I definitely advise you to use it on all your energy shield based characters. The second aura I'm using is Clarity, because even though the mana regenerated is quite low, it scales with your increased mana regeneration. And because of that, as you can see over here, instead of 28.7, if I'm using my Clarity aura, my mana regeneration is actually increased to 65.5. And as I said, this is due to the increased mana regeneration nodes that you skill in your tree, and also because of increased mana regeneration on gear. And Clarity actually reserves a lot of mana, but the benefit is definitely worth it, and I definitely advise you to use Clarity on your character. One thing you want to keep in mind when you're using Clarity is that you don't want to level it too far, because at higher levels it actually reserves quite a lot of mana. And I want to have a little bit of mana buffer to cast my spells without running out of mana too fast. And that's why I stopped leveling it at level 16. The third aura I'm using is Grace. Grace is actually a really great aura because it grants a fixed amount of evasion, and evasion rating is not only increased by dexterity, which I have a little bit of, but it's also increased by the evasion rating nodes and energy shield nodes that I have skilled over here. And that's why if I'm using Grace, I actually get about 1100 evasion rating. And 1100 evasion rating translates to 11% chance to evade against level 71 enemies. But since I'm doing level 60 to level 65 maps, the evasion chance to evade is actually a lot higher. And basically Grace, for 70 mana reserved, you get about 20 to 25% effective health pool, and it's really worth it. I definitely advise you to use Grace as well. The next thing I'm going to show you is Phase Run. I'm using also Phase Run with the... Oh, I almost forgot, I'm using the reduced mana gem support for my auras, obviously, because it reduces the amount of mana reserved to 74% of the base mana reservation, which is a huge deal. And I definitely advise you to use reduced mana on these auras as well. Now to the Phase Run gem. I'm using Phase Run with increased duration. Usually Phase Run lasts about 7 to 8 seconds, depending on level, but with increased duration it lasts about 13 seconds. And it's a great tool to get faster and to get to your enemies, to the next enemy pack a lot faster, and it's also a really great defensive tool in case you are surrounded or something like that. And in the future, if I manage to get a green socket over here, I'm going to put Blood Rage in. Blood Rage is the gem that gives you a buff for a certain amount of time, and this buff makes it so that if you kill an enemy, you get a frenzy charge. And frenzy charges not only increase attack speed, they also increase cast speed. And because of that, and because of the increased duration, I will have 3 frenzy charges for the whole duration. As long as you kill enemies, you will have frenzy charges. But it really turned out to be a quite difficult task to get green, green, red on a blue wand. And that's why I'm holding off on this task for now. The next thing I'm using is Frostbite. I'm using Frostbite because obviously it increases cold damage, but it also gives additional chance to freeze your enemies, which is the core of this build. And it's an obvious choice, and I'm also using reduced mana and increased area of effect for this skill gun. And as you can see, the increased area actually makes the radius for the curse really, really large. The next thing I'm using is Ice Spear, and this Ice Spear is actually my single target Ice Spear, because bosses and rares sometimes have a lot of life, and if they have a lot of life, the totem on its own isn't really able to perma-freeze them, because the duration of the freeze effect depends on the damage you do with the single crit. If you crit for 50% of the rare's life, he's frozen for a lot longer than if you take away 10% life. And because of that, you want to have a single target attack which deals a lot of damage. And that's why I'm using Ice Spear. And I'm using Ice Spear with the increased critical damage support gem, because as I said, the Ice Spear not only has a lot of crit chance anyways at a certain distance traveled. Basically, it has about 100% critical strike chance at this distance. And because of that, you want to use critical damage to increase the burst damage to a really large number. And I'm also using faster casting. If you cast faster, you get off more hits, and if you get off more hits, you have more chances to freeze your enemy. And it also increases your damage by quite a lot, but that's only secondary. Third thing, I'm using added chaos damage. Added chaos damage is the gem that gives the most damage after these two. And because of that, it's the obvious choice. Because if you have more damage, you freeze the enemies for a longer time. And that's why I'm using added chaos damage. And the fourth is actually obviously Ice Spear. The second Ice Spear I'm using is the one with the totem. And I'm using it in a 5-link spell totem with increased critical damage, for the same reason as stated earlier. You want to have as much damage as possible on impact, and since Ice Spear has a really high crit chance anyways, the totem is going to manage to freeze your enemies with critical strikes, and if you get more damage, you freeze them for a longer duration. Ice Spear obviously, and the other is faster casting for the same reason as here, and the last one is greater multiple projectiles to have a really large radius and freeze as many enemies possible at once. And the last skill I'm using is Ice Nova. Ice Nova I'm using with the added lightning damage instead of chaos damage, because if you are using lightning damage, since I have a lot of crit chance, if you crit, you get the lightning elemental ailment, and the lightning elemental ailment is shocked. What is shock doing in this game? Shock actually increases damage done to the enemies that are shocked by 40%. And this debuff stacks 3 times, which means you can stack it up to 120% increased damage taken. And since I have a lot of crit chance, I managed to shock the enemies in a really large radius, which not only increases my damage, it also increases the damage of my totem. And that's why instead of increased critical damage, which I'm using in the other two setups, I'm using increased critical strikes instead for my Ice Nova. Because Ice Nova doesn't have the same ability as the Ice Spear with 600% increased critical strike chance at a certain distance traveled. It only has about 30% critical strike chance with my setup, about 32%, and additional 12% chance to freeze due to the frostbite curse. And if I manage to get a crit with Ice Nova, the lightning damage shocks my enemies. And that's why I'm using increased critical strikes. and the other one is obviously faster casting. It not only increases damage by a lot, it also enables you to cast a lot more often and thus freeze your enemies and crit your enemies for more often than without. And the items I'm using are actually really crappy, except for the quantity and rarity find stuff, as I already explained in the last video. And I'm going to hover over all of them to give you an idea of what kind of items you want to use with this kind of witch. Because this witch is actually really defensive and has quite a large health pool, and her effective health pool is even larger. And that's why you can get away with gear like this. And the ones I'm using are really good actually. This one has increased spell damage, cast speed and maximum mana. This one has maximum mana, increased spell damage and increased mana regeneration. And the rings I'm using are also increased rarity and quantity find rings. If I manage to get better rings, I'm going to replace these, but it actually is going to be quite difficult because this additional 27 strength over here means that I can't take it off without my gear becoming red, which means I can't use it because the reduced mana support gem actually requires a lot of strength, and I leveled them a little bit too far. That's why I'm going to warn you right now, don't level your gems too high. You don't actually get a lot of benefit for 1 or 2 levels, but the required strength actually increases by a lot. And my armor obviously is a 5 link, but the stats aren't really that good. My amulet is actually really good. It not only has increased global critical strike multiplier, which gives a lot of damage because I'm critting a lot really often, but it also has increased armor. And this increased armor, 11%, actually also applies to the granite flask I'm using. And the circlet I'm using is also a rarity find one. And yeah, that's it. If you have gear that is similar to this, or even better, all that is left to do is cast your auras, cast your phase run, get your map, start searching for enemies, and if you find them, you curse them, put down your totem, and start owning enemies. Have fun.